Remembers, what if the most terrifying civilization in human history didn't disappear because it was weak but because it's too advanced to stop itself? Remembers, what if Atlantis isn't lost beneath the ocean, but quietly waiting for us to repeat its final mistake? Before we begin, let me ask you something unsettling. Remembers, what if one of the greatest warnings ever written about human civilization was never meant to be found? What if it wasn't buried under the ocean, remembers, but hidden in plain sight inside a philosophical text we've been reading for more than 2,000 years? Remembers, without truly listening, what if Atlantis was never a place you could locate on a map, but a mirror, members, quietly reflecting who we are every time civilization grows powerful enough to believe it cannot fall? Remembers, tonight I don't want to tell you a legend, I want to invite you into a question, one that has followed humanity for over 2 millennia. Welcome to Empires Historical. I'm not standing here as an expert who claims to have the answers. Members, I'm standing here as someone who became genuinely unsettled the deeper I went into this story. The more I read, remembers, the more uncomfortable it became, because Atlantis refuses to stay in the past. It keeps resurfacing again and again, precisely when societies feel most confident, most advanced, most certain of their own permanence. Remembers, and that alone should make us pause. Atlantis enters history not through ruins, not through archaeology. Remembers, not through myth passed down by wandering storytellers, but through philosophy. Around 360 BC, in the heart of Athens, as Plato writes 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, together they contain the only ancient account of Atlantis we possess. Remembers, no second source, no competing version, no archaeological confirmation, just one man, one voice, one story. Remembers, that alone is strange. Plato does not present Atlantis as a fairy tale, he frames it carefully, almost defensively. Remembers, through layers of narration, Critias tells the story, claiming he heard it from his great-grandfather. Remembers, who heard it from Solon, the legendary Athenian lawgiver. Remembers, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests guarding records thousands of years old. It's an odd structure. Remembers, almost like Plato wants us to ask, do you believe this? Should you? And if not, why are you still listening? Remembers, according to the story, Atlantis was a vast island empire, unimaginably wealthy and technologically advanced. Remembers, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, its people were once virtuous, disciplined, and wise until abundance turned into excess. Remembers, power into arrogance and confidence into moral decay. Eventually, in a single day and night of catastrophe, remembers, Atlantis vanished beneath the sea. That's the part everyone remembers. But here's the detail that changed everything for me. Remembers, Plato does not present Atlantis as the hero of the story. Athens is. Ancient Athens, idealized, disciplined. Remembers, morally ordered, stands against Atlantis and defeats it. Atlantis is not tragic because it was destroyed. Remembers, Atlantis is tragic because it deserved to fall. And that tells us something crucial. Plato wasn't writing about geography. Remembers, he was writing about power. Remembers, he was writing about what happens when civilizations mistake strength for virtue, when technological mastery is wisdom, when moral restraint is treated as an obstacle rather than a foundation. Remembers, this is not a neutral story, it's an accusation, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. Remembers, what makes Atlantis disturbing isn't that we can find it, it's that we recognize it. Every empire that has ever believed itself exceptional has seen its reflection in Atlantis, sometimes unconsciously. Remembers, sometimes deliberately. Roman thinkers quietly dismissed it, medieval scholars avoided it, Renaissance humanists revived it. Modern mystics transformed it, scientists tried to kill it, popular culture resurrected it. Atlantis refuses to die. Remembers, why? Because the question it asks is timeless. What happens when human capability grows faster than human wisdom? Remembers, that question haunted Plato. And if we be honest, it haunts us too. We live in an age of unprecedented power. Remembers, we shape the planet, we alter the climate, we split atoms, we create machines that think. And yet, remembers, for all our sophistication, our moral clarity feels fragile, polarized, reactive, exhausted. That's why Atlantis keeps coming back. Remembers, not as evidence but as anxiety, not as history but as warning. And here's where I want to be very clear about my role in this journey. I'm not here to convince you Atlantis was real. I'm not here to debunk it either. Remember, here because I became fascinated by why we keep arguing about it, why Plato's story, written before modern science, members, before global empires, before industrial technology, still feels uncomfortably relevant, why people across centuries, philosophers, remembers, mystics, scientists, artists keep trying to claim Atlantis for their own worldview, and why, perhaps more than ever, remembers, we feel drawn to stories about lost civilizations at the very moment our own civilization feels both unstoppable and strangely unstable. Remembers, that tension is where this story lives. In this series, we were going to walk together through the entire life cycle of Atlantis, not as a place, but as an idea. Remembers, we'll begin with Plato's original intention and the philosophical world he lived in. Remembers, we'll watch Atlantis transform from allegory into supposed history, from history into occult revelation. Remembers, from revelation into pop culture obsession. We'll look at the scientists who tried to bury it, the mystics who tried to resurrect it, remembers, and the modern media that turned it into spectacle. But more importantly, we'll ask what Atlantis says about us, about our hunger for lost wisdom, our fear of collapse, our discomfort with complexity. remembers, and our tendency to project modern anxieties onto ancient stories. This is not a neutral exploration. Remembers, it's a reflective one, because every generation that retells Atlantis reveals more about itself than about the past. Remembers, and before we go any further, let me ask you one more thing. If you read drawn to stories like this, stories that explore power, remembers, collapse, myth, history, and the psychology of civilizations, consider subscribing to Empire's Historical. Remembers, it's the best way to support the channel and help us keep producing long-form, thoughtful explorations like this one. Remembers, now let's begin properly, because Atlantis doesn't start in the ocean. Remembers, it starts in the human mind at the exact moment we begin to wonder whether progress alone is enough to save us from ourselves. Remember, if Atlantis began as a question about power, then the next step is unavoidable. Remembers, we have to sit down with the man who asked that question first and understand why he asked it the way he did. Remembers, because Plato did not write Atlantis accidentally, and he did not write it innocently. To understand this part of the story, remembers, I had to stop thinking like a modern reader and step into Plato's world, a world shaken, wounded, and deeply suspicious of human ambition. Remembers, Plato was born into a civilization that believed itself to be the pinnacle of human achievement. Athens had defeated Persia. Remembers, it built monuments, perfected rhetoric, and invented democracy. It saw itself not merely as powerful, but as morally superior. And then, within a single generation, it watched itself collapse. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. Its empire unraveled. Its democracy condemned Socrates, Plato's teacher, to death. What Plato inherited was not a golden age, remembers, but a warning, a civilization that had mistaken cleverness for wisdom, freedom for virtue, and power for righteousness. Remembers, this matters because Atlantis is not a neutral myth, it is a response. When Plato writes Timaeus and Critias, remembers, he is not asking, did Atlantis exist? He is asking, what destroys civilizations that believe they are enlightened? For that question shapes everything. Plato places Atlantis in deliberate contrast with an idealized ancient Athens. But it's not the real Athens of demagogues and mob rule, but a purified version, disciplined, hierarchical, morally ordered. Remembers, in Plato's telling, this ancient Athens stands alone against Atlantis, not because it is richer or more advanced, remembers, but because it is better governed. That's the key. Atlantis fails not because it lacks technology, but it fails because it loses restraint. Plato describes Atlantis in loving, almost obsessive detail. The concentric rings of land and water, the massive canals, the harbors filled with ships, the walls plated in metals, brass, tin, and orichalcum, the temple of Poseidon glittering with gold and silver, the enormous military forces, counted with mathematical precision. Remembers, these numbers are not accidental, they're exaggerated on purpose. Plato wants Atlantis to feel overwhelming. Remembers, too large, too rich, too powerful, almost grotesque in its abundance, and at first Atlantis is virtuous. Remembers, its rulers are semi-divine, descended from Poseidon. They govern with moderation, they respect law. Remembers, they value harmony. Plato makes this clear. Greatness itself is not the problem begins when the divine element fades. As generations pass, Atlantis becomes more human and less disciplined. The rulers grow obsessed with wealth. Remembers, expansion becomes policy, power becomes identity. The Atlanteans stop asking what is just and start asking what is possible. Remembers, this is where Plato's philosophy becomes impossible to ignore. In the Republic, Plato outlines the life cycle political systems. Aristocracy decays into timocracy, timocracy into oligarchy, oligarchy into democracy, democracy into tyranny. Remembers, each stage is marked by a moral failure before it becomes a political one. Atlantis follows this pattern perfectly. As what begins as noble order collapses into excess. And excess, in Plato's worldview, is not merely immoral, it is unstable. Remembers, invites chaos, it violates cosmic balance, it provokes correction. So when Atlantis is destroyed, remembers, it is not punished arbitrarily, it is corrected. This is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the story. As Plato does not frame the catastrophe as tragedy alone, he frames it as necessity. The universe, in his worldview, remembers, does not tolerate civilizations that sever power from virtue indefinitely. That idea should feel unsettling. Remembers, it certainly did to me, because Plato is not just talking about Atlantis, he is talking about Athens. Remembers, and by extension, he is talking about any civilization that believes its success exempts it from moral limits. Remembers, what makes this more fascinating is how carefully Plato positions Atlantis in time and space. Remembers, he places it 9,000 years before his own era, far beyond historical verification. This does two things at once. Remembers, it gives the story an aura of ancient authority while also making it immune to direct contradiction. Remembers, you cannot disprove what cannot be checked at the same time. Remembers, he places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, outside the familiar Mediterranean world. It is close enough to feel threatening, remembers, but distant enough to remain mysterious. This is not sloppy storytelling, it is strategic. Plato understood how myths function. Remembers, he knew that myths are not meant to be analyzed like court transcripts. They are meant to bypass resistance. Remembers, to embed lessons emotionally rather than logically. That's why Atlantis is told through Critias, not through Socrates. That's why it is framed as inherited memory rather than philosophical argument. Remembers, Plato wants the listener to suspend disbelief just long enough for the message to land, and the message is clear. Remembers, civilizations collapse from the inside first. What struck me most reading Plato carefully is how modern his anxiety feels. Remembers, he worries about democracy without discipline, about leaders chasing popularity instead of wisdom. Remembers, about societies that equate wealth with virtue, about expansion justified by ideology rather than necessity. Remembers, Atlantis is Plato's warning label, and yet, almost immediately after Plato's death, the story begins to fracture. Remembers, Aristotle, his most famous student, dismisses Atlantis entirely. He reportedly says that the man who invented it also destroyed it. Remembers, this wasn't casual skepticism, it reflected a deeper philosophical divide. Plato believed myth could convey truth. Remember, Aristotle believed truth must be empirical. For Aristotle, Atlantis was dangerous not because it might be false, remembers, but because it blurred the line between philosophy and history. It looked too precise, too numerical. Remembers, too factual for something meant to be symbolic, and that criticism mattered, because from this point onward, remembers, Atlantis becomes unstable. Is it allegory? Is it history? Is it both? Remembers. Different traditions will answer that question differently, and the answers will shape how Atlantis evolves for the next 2,000 years. Remembers, what's important here is not who was right, it's what this disagreement reveals. Plato trusted humans to extract wisdom from myth. Aristotle did not, and history suggests Aristotle may have underestimated how badly people want myths to be real. Remembers, once Atlantis exists on the page, it takes on a life of its own. Some readers treat it as warning. Remembers, others treat it as evidence. Some see philosophy, others see lost knowledge waiting to be recovered. Remembers, this split begins right here in Plato's shadow, and it explains why Atlantis never settles into a single meaning. Remembers, because Plato didn't write it to answer a question, he wrote it to haunt one. And if you feel that tension between fascination and skepticism, between admiration and unease, then you're re-experiencing Atlantis exactly as Plato intended. But that tension does not remain philosophical for long. In the centuries that follow, remembers, Atlantis will be pulled out of Plato's controlled framework and reinterpreted by people with very different needs, members' fears and desires. What begins as moral allegory will slowly be reimagined as hidden history, secret wisdom, remembers, and eventually spiritual inheritance. That transformation tells us as much about human psychology as it does about Plato. Remembers, and that is where our journey leads next, away from philosophy and into belief. If Plato planted Atlantis as a philosophical warning, remembers, then what happened next reveals something far more intimate and far more human about how we respond to that warning when it becomes uncomfortable. Remembers, because when a story stops accusing society and starts unsettling the individual, it rarely remains philosophical for long. Remembers, for many centuries after Plato, Atlantis lingered at the margins of serious thought. Classical scholars debated it, dismissed it, or cautiously reinterpreted it. Medieval Europe largely forgot it. But when Atlantis re-emerged with force in the modern era, remembers, it did not return as Plato's moral allegory, it returned as promise. This shift did not happen because new evidence was discovered. Remembers, it happened because the modern world created a psychological vacuum that Atlantis was perfectly suited to fill. Remembers, to understand this phase of the story, I had to stop asking, is this true? And start asking a different question. Remembers, why did so many people need it to be true? By the late 19th century, Western society was undergoing a profound identity crisis. Traditional religious authority was weakening, scientific materialism was rising. Remembers, industrialization was transforming daily life at an inhuman pace. Cities grew, machines multiplied, and individuals increasingly felt small, anonymous, and disconnected from meaning. Progress was everywhere. Remembers, wisdom felt absent. In that environment, Atlantis transformed, no longer a cautionary tale about power. Remembers, it became a reassurance, a story that said humanity had once been greater than it is now and could be again. Remembers, this is where figures like Ignatius Donnelly enter the story. Donnelly was not a mystic, he was not a philosopher. He was a politician, a populist outsider who distrusted academic elites and believed that established intuition sealed truth from ordinary people. When he published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882, he framed it as scholarship, but emotionally, as was Remembers. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was real, advanced, global, and ancient. More importantly, Remembers, he argued that nearly all human civilization descended from it. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Americas, according to Donnelly, Remembers, these were fragments of a shattered inheritance. The appeal was immediate. If Atlantis was real, Remembers, then modern humanity was not primitive, it was fallen. If Atlantis was real, Remembers, then inequality between cultures could be explained as degeneration, not inferiority. If Atlantis was real, then lost wisdom existed waiting to be recovered. Remember, this idea resonated deeply in a world struggling to reconcile technological mastery with spiritual emptiness. But Donnelly's work did something else, something far more consequential. Remembers, it established a pattern that would define the next century of Atlantis thinking: selective comparison. Remembers, similar myths, proof of shared origin, similar architecture, evidence of Atlantean instruction, similar symbols. Remembers, cultural memory, contradictions were dismissed, chronology was stretched, context was ignored. What mattered was not coherence. Remembers, what mattered was meaning. And once Atlantis became meaningful in this way, it was no longer controlled by philosophy or history. Remembers, it was claimed by belief. This belief took its most influential form through the rise of Theosophy and New Age spirituality, members particularly through Helena Blavatsky. Blavatsky did not treat Atlantis as a lost civilization. Remember, she treated it as a stage of human evolution. In her framework, Atlantis was not just ancient, it was cosmic. Remembers, Atlanteans were not merely skilled, they were spiritually advanced beings with psychic abilities, direct access to higher dimensions, remembers, and technologies powered by consciousness rather than mechanics. Here, Atlantis ceased to be about society. Remembers, it became about the self. According to Blavatsky, modern humans were not inferior, they were amnesia. Remembers, we had forgotten what we once were. Spiritual enlightenment was not something new to be achieved, but something ancient to be remembered. This is a subtle but critical shift. Plato's Atlantis warned against moral decline. Theosophy reframed as loss of hidden potential. And that reframing is psychologically powerful. If you feel alienated, remembers, it is not because society is flawed, it is because you are out of place in time. If you feel disconnected, remembers, it is not because meaning is absent, because you remember something others do not. If modern life feels hollow, remembers, it is because it is a degraded echo of a higher past. Atlantis became a spiritual ancestry. Remembers, this pattern intensified in the 20th century through figures like Edgar Cayce. Remembers, Cayce claimed to access Atlantis through psychic readings, describing crystal technologies, advanced energy systems, remembers, and moral conflicts between enlightened factions and corrupt elites. What struck me reading these accounts was not their content, remembers, but their structure. They mirror modern anxieties almost perfectly. Advanced energy used irresponsibly. Remembers, technology outpacing ethics, elite groups hoarding power, a catastrophic collapse triggered by misuse rather ignorance. Remembers, Atlantis in this form stops being ancient history and becomes a symbolic rehearsal for modern fear. And crucially, Cayce Atlantis introduces reincarnation. According to this view, remembers, many people alive today are reincarnated Atlantean souls returning to get it right this time. That idea deserves careful attention, because it explains why Atlantis belief often carries such emotional intensity. Remembers, if you believe Atlantis is part of your personal spiritual history, then criticism feels personal. Skepticism becomes attack, archaeology becomes threat, Atlantis belief becomes identity, and once belief becomes identity, remembers, evidence becomes irrelevant. This is not unique to Atlantis, it is a universal psychological mechanism. But Atlantis is a perfect vessel for it because it offers something rare, specialness without obligation. Remembers, you do not need to prove Atlantis existed, you only need to feel that it mattered. This is why New Age Atlantis narratives flourish alongside distrust of institutions, academia, and mainstream science. They do not compete on evidence, they compete on meaning, and meaning is powerful. But it also comes with a cost. Remembers, because when Atlantis is transformed from warning into promise, something essential is lost. Plato's Atlantis forces humility. New Age Atlantis often reinforces ego. Remembers, the idea that humanity once possessed godlike abilities suggests that collapse was not a consequence of Moro but an accident. Remembers, a misunderstanding, a cosmic reset, responsibility dissolves. Instead of asking what went wrong, we ask, remembers, how do we get it back? That difference matters. As I followed Atlantis through this phase of its evolution, remembers, I began to notice something unsettling. The more Atlantis became spiritualized, the less it challenged power. In Plato's version, Atlantis is destroyed because it abuses power. In occult versions, destruction becomes a necessary step in spiritual evolution, almost cleansing. Collapse is reframed as destiny rather than consequence. Remembers, and that reframing is comforting. It suggests that no matter what we do, history resets, souls return, and wisdom eventually triumphs. But comfort is not the same as truth. This is where skepticism re-enters the story, not as dismissal, remembers, but as counterweight, because while New Age Atlantis offered meaning, science was beginning to offer something else. Was precision. Archaeology, geology, and oceanography advanced rapidly in the 20th century. Radiocarbon dating, remember, stratigraphy, plate tectonics, these tools did not attack Atlantis directly, they simply made it unnecessary. Remembers, and that created friction. When the ocean floor was mapped and no sunken continent appeared, Atlantis did not disappear. Members adapted. When geological timelines predicted catastrophic submersion, Atlantis did not retreat. It relocated to Antarctica, to the Caribbean, to Spain, to the Azores. Every absence of evidence became evidence of suppression. Remember, this is the moment where Atlantis belief begins to resemble something more troubling, not curiosity, but resistance to limits. Limits on knowledge, limits on speculation, limits on what can reasonably be claimed. Remembers, and yet I don't think it's helpful to mock this impulse, because beneath it is something very human. There's a longing for coherence, a longing for significance, a longing to believe that history has direction, remembers that we are part of it in a meaningful way. Atlantis provides that. It says, you are not small. Remembers, you are late, you are not ignorant, you are recovering, you are not powerless, you are remembering. Remember, that is a powerful narrative in an age of fragmentation. But it also explains why Atlantis belief can coexist so easily with conspiracy thinking. Once you believe that truth is hidden by design, remembers, every contradiction confirms the premise. This is the paradox of Atlantis in the New Age era. It emerges as a response to alienation. remembers, but it can deepen alienation by positioning believers against shared reality. It offers transcendence, remembers, but risks detachment from responsibility. It promises ancient wisdom, but often avoids ancient restraint. None of this means Atlantis belief is foolish. It means it is revealing. Remembers, it reveals how modern individuals negotiate meaning in a world where traditional structures feel insufficient, scientific explanations feel emotionally incomplete. Remembers, and that in itself is valuable to understand, because Atlantis is no longer just a story about the past. Remembers, and has become a story about what we want the past to do for us. And that transformation sets the stage for the next phase of this journey, where science, archaeology, remembers, and modern media attempt to reclaim the narrative not by belief but by method, not by promise but by evidence. And that encounter will be far less mystical and far more uncomfortable. Remembers, if Atlantis had transformed into belief because it offered meaning, then the next turn in the story was inevitable. Remembers, a confrontation with a way of knowing that does not ask what we need to be true, but what can actually be shown. Remember, this is where science enters the Atlantis story not as a villain, not as a destroyer of wonder, but as an uncompromising mirror. For a long time I thought science simply debunked Atlantis and moved on. But the deeper I looked, remembers, the clearer it became that this phase is not about arrogance or dismissal. It is about something far more unsettling. Remembers, the slow, methodical realization that some stories persist not because they are true, but because they are emotionally necessary. Remembers, modern archaeology did not set out to disprove Atlantis. It did not begin with Plato in mind at all. It began with dirt, stone, bone, and layers of time. Its questions were narrow, technical, almost boring. Remembers, when was this built, by whom, with what tools, and why? And that's precisely why the results were so powerful. Remembers, as archaeological methods matured in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, something unexpected happened. Remembers, the ancient world did not become simpler, it became far more complex. Civilizations emerged independently in multiple regions. Remembers, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and urban planning developed at different times in different ways, under different conditions. There was no single mother civilization, there was no global reset. Remembers, there was no lost technological pinnacle buried in prehistory. Instead, there was something less dramatic and far more humbling. Remembers, human ingenuity repeating itself, constrained by environment, resources, and incremental learning. Remembers, this posed a direct challenge to Atlantis narratives rooted in lost perfection. Because if Egypt, Mesopotamia, remembers, the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica developed independently, then Atlantis was no longer necessary as an explanation. Remembers, the similarities Dunley and others point to could be explained by convergent solutions to similar problems. Remembers, not shared inheritance, but the real confrontation came not on land but beneath the sea. If Atlantis existed as described, continent-sized, remembers, technologically advanced, populated by millions, then it would have left a geological footprint, not ruins. Remembers, not statues, something far more fundamental, disrupted sediment layers, continental crust where none should exist, traces of land-based ecosystems. Oceanography made this testable. Throughout the 20th century, remember, scientists mapped the ocean floor with increasing precision. Sonar revealed abyssal plains stretching thousands of meters deep. The mid-Atlantic ridge emerged as a volcanic boundary, not a sunken continent. Remembers, core samples pulled from the seabed revealed millions of years of uninterrupted marine sediment, no sudden transition from land to sea within the timeframe Plato described. Remembers, this was not interpretation, it was measurement. Atlantis as a sunken continent simply wasn't either. Remembers, what struck me was not how decisive this evidence was, but how little it mattered to believers. Remembers, because something important had already shifted. Atlantis was no longer a hypothesis, it was a narrative role. And narratives do not surrender easily to data. As geology closed one door, belief opened others. Atlantis migrated. Remembers, it moved from the central Atlantic to the Caribbean to Antarctica to the Mediterranean, to submerged continental shelves exposed during the last ice age. Each relocation followed the same logic. Remembers, find a place where data is incomplete, then fill the gap with interpretation. This is not unique to Atlantis. Remembers, it is how speculative belief adapts under pressure. Remembers, but Atlantis became a case study in this process because it attracted attention from almost every scientific discipline at once. Archaeology tested material culture, geology tested landforms, climatology tested flood scenarios. Remembers, genetics tested population continuity, linguistics tested cultural transmission, and across all of them, remembers, a pattern emerged. Human history is messy, local, gradual, and resilient. Atlantis requires it to be sudden, but centralized and absolute. Those two visions do not align. Remembers, one of the most interesting moments in this phase comes from the study of real catastrophes. The ancient world did experience collapses. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC destroyed multiple civilizations. Volcanic eruptions like Thera devastated regions. Remembers, floods wiped out settlements. Climate shifts destabilized societies. These events are dramatic, traumatic. Remembers, memorable, and they leave evidence. When archaeologists excavate sites like Akrotiri on Santorini, they find layers of ash, abandoned homes, unfinished meals. They see sudden disruption, but within a clearly defined cultural context. There was a civilization ends, but others continue. Trade networks adapt, knowledge migrates. Collapse is not global. It is specific. Atlantis, by contrast, remembers, requires a civilization so advanced and widespread that its destruction reshapes the entire world and yet leaves no trace that can be independently verified. Remembers, that contradiction is hard to ignore, but science did something else that quietly undermined Atlantis in a different way. Remembers, it made ancient civilizations more impressive, not less. The more we learned about Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Minoan Crete, and Shang China, the clearer it became that humans did not need lost super civilizations to explain sophistication. Remembers, they achieved it themselves repeatedly under constraints we can study and respect. Remembers, this robbed Atlantis of one of its most powerful appeals, the idea that ancient achievement must have come from somewhere else. Remembers, and yet instead of diminishing Atlantis' popularity, this seemed to intensify it. Why? Because science answers questions, remembers, but it does not soothe the anxieties. It explains how civilizations form, but not why we feel they shouldn't fail. Remembers, it describes collapse but does not promise redemption. It offers understanding, not reassurance. And Atlantis, remembers, at this stage had become reassurance. This is where the tension sharpens. For those committed to evidence, remembers, Atlantis became an instructive example of how myths persist despite contradiction. For those committed to meaning, remembers, science became a threat not because it was wrong, but because it was insufficient. I found myself caught between these positions. Remembers, on one hand, the data is overwhelming. There is no archaeological evidence for Plato's Atlantis as a historical civilization. Remembers, none, not underwater, not in ice cores or Dana. On the other hand, dismissing Atlantis entirely felt incomplete. It's because science had explained why Atlantis wasn't real, but not why it mattered so much. This is where modern media enters the story. Remembers, television documentaries, pseudo-documentaries, and later internet platforms blurred the line between investigation and entertainment. Remembers, dramatic reconstructions, authoritative narration, and selective framing created the illusion of legitimacy without accountability. Remembers, what fascinated me wasn't that these programs were speculative, it was how carefully they avoided closure. Remember, every episode ends not with resolution but with possibility. What if we haven't looked deep enough? What if evidence is hidden? What if mainstream science is wrong? These questions keep Atlantis alive not as fact, remembered as invitation. An invitation is powerful, especially in a world where institutional trust is fragile. Members, but there is a cost to this dynamic, because when speculation is framed as suppressed truth, skepticism becomes complicity. Evidence becomes bias. Expertise becomes gatekeeping. Atlantis belief at this stage stops being about history at all. Remembers, it becomes about epistemology, how we decide what counts as knowledge. Science insists on limits. Atlantis narratives resist them. Remembers, and this resistance reveals something essential. Atlantis thrives where certain feels dangerous and ambiguity feels empowering. Remembers, where distrust of authority intersects with desire for transcendence. This is not stupidity, it is psychology. Remembers, and it explains why even the most thorough scientific debunking does not end the story. Remembers, because science asks us to accept that the past is fragmented, incomplete, and sometimes disappointing. Remembers, Atlantis asks us to believe the past was magnificent and that its loss explains our dissatisfaction with the present. Remembers, one is honest, the other is comforting, neither is emotionally neutral. What science does offer, however, remembers, is something Atlantis narratives rarely do: accountability. When archaeologists revise timelines, they publish corrections. When theories fail, they are abandoned. When evidence contradicts belief, belief must change or be exposed as leaf. Remembers, Atlantis does not operate that way. It absorbs contradiction and reframes it as mystery. And that is why, remembers, by the late 20th century, Atlantis had effectively split into two parallel existences. In academia, remembers, it became a footnote of philosophical allegory misread as history. In popular culture, it became more vivid than ever. Remembers, films, games, novels, and documentaries presented Atlantis as visually real, technologically dazzling. Remembers, emotionally resonant. It no longer needed to be proven, it needed to be seen. And once Atlantis became image rather than argument, remembers, something fundamental changed. It entered the realm of imagination permanently. Remembers, science could map the ocean floor 1,000 times and still lose ground to a single compelling visual of a sunken city glowing beneath the waves. Remembers, that realization unsettled me, not because science failed but because it revealed its limits. Science can tell us what happened. Remembers, it cannot tell us what we long for, and Atlantis sits precisely at that intersection. As we move forward, remembers, this tension becomes impossible to ignore, because the final stage of Atlantis' journey is not about belief versus evidence. It is about us, about why a civilization that prides itself on rationality remains deeply drawn to myths of collapse, lost wisdom, and second chances. And that brings us to the final question, one that science cannot answer. Remembers, a myth refuses to let go. What does Atlantis say about the moment we are living in right now? Remembers, if science showed us that Atlantis is not waiting beneath the ocean floor, then what remains is a far more unsettling realization. Remembers, the story survived not because it was hidden, but because it adapted to us. Remembers, this final turn in the journey is where Atlantis stops belonging to Plato, to mystics, or to archaeologists and becomes unmistakably modern. Remembers, at some point, I realized that asking whether Atlantis was real had become the least interesting question we could ask. Remembers, the more urgent question was this: why does a civilization with satellites, supercomputers, remembers, and global communication still feel haunted by a story about total collapse? Because Atlantis no longer functions as history. Remembers, it functions as a forecast, not a literal prediction but a psychological one. In the modern world, Atlantis has quietly merged with our anxieties about power, technology, and control. We no longer imagine it as marble temples and triremes. We imagine it as systems too complex to shut down, technologies too powerful to reverse, remembers, and consequences that arrive faster than responsibility can keep up. This is why Atlantis feels contemporary. Remembers, it mirrors the structure of our fears. We live in an age where human capability has grown faster than human consensus. Remembers, we can edit genomes before agreeing on ethics. We can automate decision-making before understanding long-term consequences. Remembers, we can alter planetary systems while still arguing about accountability. That imbalance would have made perfect sense to Plato. Remembers, Atlantis, in his telling, does not fall because it lacks intelligence. It falls because intelligence becomes unmoored from restraint. Remember, power is no longer guided by proportion. Desire overtakes judgment. Expansion replaces self-knowledge. Remembers, this is why modern retellings of Atlantis increasingly resemble cautionary tales about technology. In films and novels, Atlantis often collapses because of an energy source pushed too far. In games, remembers, it falls due to internal division and elite arrogance. In documentaries, it becomes a warning about ecological imbalance or hubris. Remembers, the aesthetic changes, the logic stays the same. Atlantis is no longer about ancient gods punishing mortals. Remembers, it is about systems punishing themselves, and that is a distinctly modern fear. We no longer worry about divine wrath. We worry about feedback loops, climate tipping points, eye alignment, nuclear escalation, financial contagion. Remembers, these are not myths, they are mechanisms, and yet when we try to talk about them directly, the conversation becomes abstract, technical, exhausting. Atlantis offers something different. It compresses complexity into story. Remembers, it allows us to talk about collapse without naming ourselves directly, to explore failure without admitting guilt, to rehearse disaster in symbolic form. Remembers, this is why Atlantis keeps resurfacing in popular culture whenever societies feel both powerful and unstable. Remembers, it happened during the Cold War. It happened during the environmental movement of the 1970s. Remembers, it is happening again in the age of climate change and artificial intelligence. Atlantis adapts because it is not about a place. It is about a moment. The moment when a civilization realizes that what it can do exceeds what it knows how to live with. Remembers, and here is the part that stayed with me the longest. Atlantis is almost always described as advanced. Remembers, enlightened, sophisticated, and yet utterly unprepared for the consequences of its own success. That combination should sound familiar. Remembers, we often assume collapse comes from ignorance, superstition, or lack of development. Atlantis suggests the opposite. Remembers, collapse comes from overconfidence, from assuming that intelligence alone guarantees wisdom, from mistaking innovation for maturity. In this sense, Atlantis is not a warning against progress, it is a warning against unexamined progress. Remembers, this is where the story quietly turns the lens on us. Modern civilization loves solutions, more data, better models, smarter systems, faster responses. We believe that every problem created by technology can be solved by more technology. Remembers, Atlantis questions that faith, not by rejecting technology, but by asking what happens when solutions themselves become sources of risk. Remembers, what happens when complexity outruns comprehension? What happens when responsibility is distributed so widely that no one feels accountable? Remembers, what happens when power is global, but ethics remain local? These are not abstract questions anymore. They shape policy debates, corporate decisions, and global tensions right now. Remembers, and this is why Atlantis continues to function as a cultural pressure point. Remembers, because it allows us to explore the possibility that collapse is not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of character. Remembers, that idea is deeply uncomfortable. It suggests that the most dangerous thing about advanced civilizations is not what they lack, but what they excuse. Plato understood this, which is why his Atlantis does not fall in ignorance or confusion. Remembers, it falls after generations of moral erosion, after virtue becomes decorative, after law becomes procedural rather than ethical. Remembers, that erosion is gradual, and that is what makes it invisible from within. Remembers, every generation of Atlanteans likely believed they were managing just fine, that expansion was necessary. Remembers, that wealth was deserved, that power was stable. No one wakes up inside collapse and calls it collapse. Remembers, they call it adaptation. This is the most unsettling insight Atlantis offers us. Collapse does not arrive with a single dramatic decision. Remembers, it arrives through thousands of reasonable ones. This is why Atlantis resonates so strongly in an age of slow-moving crisis. Remembers, climate change, environmental degradation, institutional erosion, technological dependency. Remember, none of these feel like catastrophe in daily life until they do. Remembers, Atlantis compresses that slow accumulation into a single night and day, not because that's how collapse happens, remembers, but because that's how humans finally recognize it, and recognition always comes too late. Remembers, what makes this even more complex is how Atlantis belief intersects with hope. For some, Atlantis is not a warning, remembers, but a promise, a belief that humanity once achieved balance between technology and spirituality and can do so again. Remembers that lost wisdom can be recovered, that collapse is followed by rebirth. There is something deeply human in that impulse. Remembers, we want stories where failure is not final, where knowledge survives disaster, where mistakes are redeemed rather than punished. Remembers, but this is where the story becomes dangerous if taken too literally, because hope without responsibility becomes avoidance. If collapse is inevitable, why change? If history resets, why restrain ourselves? If wisdom returns automatically, remembers, why cultivate it now? Plato did not offer that comfort in his version. Atlantis is not redeemed, is erased. Remembers, not redemption is impossible, but because it was refused when it mattered. That distinction is crucial. Remembers, Atlantis does not say collapse must happen. It says collapse happens when restraint is postponed indefinitely. Remembers, and this is where the story becomes deeply relevant to our moment. We live in a civilization that knows its rest in unprecedented detail. We model them, measure them, debate them, forecast them. Ignorance is no longer our excuse. Delay is. Remembers, this is why Atlantis continues to feel less like myth and more like metaphorical diagnosis. It diagnoses a recurring human tendency. Was to prioritize short-term advantage over long-term stability, to assume adaptability replaces foresight, remembers, and to confuse survival with success. Atlantis reminds us that survival without reflection is temporary. Remembers, and reflection without action is meaningless. As I reached the end of this exploration, remembers, I stopped thinking of Atlantis as a question about the past and started thinking of it as a question about responsibility. Remembers, not collective responsibility in the abstract, but personal responsibility. What do we excuse because it benefits us now? Remembers, what risks do we normalize because they feel distant? What limits do we resist because they feel inconvenient? Remembers, Atlantis does not accuse any single generation. It accuses a pattern, and patterns repeat until they are interrupted. Remembers, this is where the story quietly offers its final challenge. Atlantis cannot be saved. It is already gone. But the civilization hearing its story still has a choice. Remembers, that is why Atlantis has survived for over 2,000 years, not because it explains history, but because it interrogates the future. Remembers, it forces each generation to ask whether it will repeat the same logic under new conditions, whether power will be matched with restraint. Remembers, whether capability will be guided by wisdom, whether progress will be measured by speed or by sustainability. Where Atlantis does not tell us what will happen, it asks what we are becoming, and that is why even now, even after science, even after debunking, even after spectacle and myth, Atlantis refuses to disappear. Remembers, it persists because it is not waiting to be discovered, it is waiting to be recognized. Remembers, recognized as the moment a civilization realizes that collapse is not something that happens to others. Remembers, it is something that emerges from choices made while believing it could never happen at all. Whether Atlantis existed beneath the ocean is ultimately irrelevant. What matters is whether we recognize it before we resemble it too closely. That question remains unanswered. And perhaps that is exactly why the story still has power. Remembers, as this journey comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. Atlantis endures not because it answers our questions, remembers, but because it refuses to let us escape them. Across philosophy, belief, science, and modern culture, remembers, Atlantis has changed its shape again and again and has been a moral allegory, a lost golden age, a spiritual inheritance. Members of pseudo-historical obsession, a pop culture spectacle, yet beneath all those transformations, one message has remained remarkably stable. Civilizations do not collapse when they lack intelligence, remembers, but when they lose the discipline to guide it. Plato understood this long before satellites and algorithms existed. Members, he framed Atlantis as a society that possessed extraordinary capability but gradually abandoned restraint. Remembers, not overnight, not through madness, but through countless small decisions that felt justified at the time. Remembers, more power, more expansion, more comfort, less reflection, less humility, less responsibility. That is why Atlantis still speaks to us. We live in a world where our tools are powerful beyond historical comparison. We can reshape ecosystems, remembers, influence human behavior at scale, and automate decisions that affect millions. Remembers, yet the question Atlantis forces us to confront is not whether we can do these things, remembers, but whether we are cultivating the wisdom to live with their consequences. The deepest lesson of Atlantis is not about collapse itself, remembers, but about timing. Collapse does not begin when systems fail, it begins when warnings are ignored because they are inconvenient. Remembers, when long-term risks are postponed for short-term gains, when moral limits are treated as obstacles instead of safeguards. Remembers, applied to everyday life, this lesson is surprisingly practical. Atlantis asks us to examine where we trade retreat for speed. Remembers, reflection for productivity and responsibility for comfort. It challenges us to think about how we use power in our own spheres at work. Remembers, in relationships, in technology, and in the choices we normalize. Reminds us that success without self-examination is fragile. Remembers, and progress without ethics eventually turns against itself. The story does not demand that we reject advancement. Remembers, it asks that we pair advancement with humility, that we slow down long enough to ask not just what's next, but at what cost and for how long. Remembers, Atlantis ultimately survives because it places that responsibility back where it belongs, not in the past. Remembers, not in myth, not in lost civilizations, but in the present moment with us. And now I'd like to hear from you. Remembers, do you see Atlantis more as a warning about the future or as a mirror reflecting our present? Remembers, please share your thoughts in the comments below so others can read and join the discussion. And if you found this exploration meaningful, remembers, consider subscribing to Empire's Historical. Your support helps us keep creating deep, thoughtful stories about power, history, and the patterns that shape our world.